Hello, and welcome back to Fully Automated Luxury Gay Space Communism. Not sure I said those words in the right order, but you get the idea. This is our third week and our second unit. So the first week addressed what fully automated luxury gay space communism was, why we would want it, and why we might not want it. That was the second video. Last week, we talked about why now, why we need it now, why jobs are going away, or at least they might go away, and what we might do about it. And my answer is, again, fully automated luxury gay space communism. There, that's how I'm going to say it, apparently. Can't remember if I got that right or not. Now, this week is Marx, but it's also, like I said at the beginning of the second unit, which is automation. So, fully automated. We're going to spend a few weeks on automation, what that means, what it means for capitalism, what it means for jobs, what it means for production, and perhaps what it means for luxury, although we can talk about luxury later. There's a lot to say about Marx. Last week I mentioned, I also put in the notes, and I'll put it back in the notes, that Mike Duncan, the podcaster who did the History of Rome podcast and the Revolutions podcast, in his Revolutions podcast has a wonderful introduction to Marxist thinking. It's called, I think it's called Historical Materialism, which is, the name or one of the names for Marx's theories. Marx has a bunch of different names for what he's doing. I want briefly to talk about just the key aspects of Marxism as it relates to automation. I do recommend you listen to the Mike Duncan podcast. There's a lot of great stuff there. And really, I think I said this in the last video, it will be useful for you to have an introduction to Marx because Marx is incredibly important in left-wing thinking, in all forms of thinking. Marx is a huge influence on our culture. So, let me get that out of the way and just get into Marx. So, what Marx does, and this is, as far as I'm concerned, irrefutable, is he analyzes capitalism and how it works. He is responding to this previous thinker, this guy named Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, The Invisible Hand, the guy who first articulates how capitalism works. But Adam Smith was much more of a philosopher than a historian. He articulated how capitalism would work or should work, or a theory of capitalism. Marx had the receipts. Marx researched what happened in capitalism, how capitalism works, and furthermore, Marx's friend and collaborator was Friedrich Engels, who was the scion of a German manufacturing family that moved to England because that's where capitalism was really going. The Industrial Revolution and capitalism starts in England before anywhere else. So Marx witnessed capitalism. He was a writing partner and philosophical partner with a man who was more or less at the heart of capitalism in the form of Friedrich Engels, and Marx researched how capitalism had worked. So Marx articulates what capitalism is and how it works. Then he makes tons of predictions about what will happen next for capitalism. This is where we get in trouble with Marx. I want there to be two Marxes. Some people use Marxian versus Marxist to distinguish between these two. I don't think that really holds up. But let's just say there is Marx who analyzes capitalism, explains what's wrong about it, explains how it works, and explains how it is dangerous and destructive. And then there's Marx who predicts a future in which capitalism will be destroyed. And he says inevitably. This is probably the only thing I disagree with Mike Duncan about in his podcast, is Mike Duncan really downplays the inevitability. And there are ways that that makes sense, but Marx thinks capitalism is going to die. He thinks it's going to die relatively soon, and he explains why. Marxism as a prediction of what will happen in history. in the future history, which is the past for us. Marx thought this was going to happen soon. This is like the people who believed that Jesus was going to return in their lifetimes, and when he didn't, some of them realized that they had been wrong, and other of them were just like, we just got the timeline wrong. Let's move it back a little bit. Everything we said is still true. It's just, we got the timeline wrong a little bit. In other words, Marxism has become a religion. It has a series of believers, and they do what any group of religious believers do. They put their beliefs before the evidence. And in this respect, I do not have a lot of time for Marxists. They are incredibly frustrating. Every single one of them has their own updating of Marx that explains why he is still right in his predictions. Every single one of them is wrong because Marx's predictions have already been proved incorrect. Here's a fun little story. If you were taught what science is at some point, if you were taught the method of science, you were probably taught this idea, comes from this philosopher named Karl Popper. You probably weren't taught the philosopher of falsifiability, testability. Science has to make predictions that can be tested. If you have a theory, it can be proven wrong. And if it can be proven wrong, it is wrong. And Popper says, the more predictions a theory makes and the stronger and more exact those predictions are, the better it is. And that's what science is. Testing theories and finding them to be wrong. And that's why we call something like the theory of gravity, right, instead of the law of gravity, because theory means the thing that we cannot prove wrong yet. But we're not going to say it's true because we can't say anything is true, according to Popper's version of science, which is the version of science that we are doing in the 21st century. We can just say, I haven't been able to disprove this yet. And Popper developed that formulation because he was sick of the Freudians and the Adlerians, but most importantly, the Marxists, explaining that even though Marx had made predictions, and those predictions had been flagrantly wrong, Marx was still right, and Marxism was scientific. So our modern notion of science was invented by a philosopher who got sick of people insisting that Marx was right, even though we know Marx was wrong. He was wrong in his prediction of what would happen in history. He made predictions, they didn't happen. They're not going to happen in the future because they have already not happened. Even if something like what Marx said would happen happens, it is too late. He's already been wrong. Whew, okay? Sorry. Maybe I lost you because you're too Marxist. Maybe this seems too far away from fully automated luxury gates-based communism, but I had to get my shots in at the Marxists. Hopefully some of you are watching, and you can write angry things in the comments about how Marx is actually right. I would really enjoy that. Okay, so forget about that Marx. Forget about the historical prediction Marx. What about the describes how capitalism works Marx? Here's how capitalism works according to Marx. And in this respect, I don't see how he could possibly be wrong. So, in ye olden times, whatever these times are, you are going to have someone producing things, whether that is someone is making something, whether you're making a shoe, or whether you are farming or building a building, that is production. And then what happens? Well, it gets consumed. We have production and consumption. Things are made and then things are used. And along the way, they get paid for. So, that's basically how things have always worked, or at least have worked for a really long time, as long as there has been money and a money economy, which is, there have been money economies for thousands of years. So what's new about capitalism? Well, the first thing, and this predates capitalism, but it really, really, really starts going with capitalism, is specialization of labor, and especially the assembly line. This is the thing that Adam Smith writes about Well, not the assembly line yet. That comes a little later. That comes in the early 20th century, late 19th century. Smith is writing much earlier than that, over 100 years earlier than that. But he says, when you look at a factory, and by the way, he steals this example from the French Encyclopedia of, I think, Diderot, but doesn't matter. He says he visited the factory. That's not true, but forget about that. Adam Smith says, when you visit the factory, no one is making a pin, like a pin or a nail, something that, it's a piece of metal that's been sharpened and then has a head on it and has been wrapped up and can be sold. No one is making that. Someone is, cutting the metal, someone is sharpening the metal, someone is making the head, someone is affixing the head on, someone is putting them in a box, someone is putting the box in paper, someone is tying off the paper, etc., etc., etc. And when you do this, you get an enormous increase in productivity. Whatever it is that humans are making, you get tons more of it. Okay, so that's the factory. Marx wants to point out a very different aspect of this. So the first thing is alienation. So I can't pronounce the word pin, P-I-N. I say pin and pin the same way, so I'm going to stop saying pins because I feel a little anxious every time I say the word pin. What does he mean, pin or pin? Pin, I'm sorry. So, getting away from pins, let's say shoes. If you are doing this, you are not making a shoe. What if you're the person who puts the aglet, I think that's what it's called, on the end of a shoelace? What are you going to do? That's all you are going to do all day. Is pinch that little aglet on. You will never see a shoe. You will do nothing but pinch, pinch, pinch all day. You're going to get some sort of repetitive use injury, right? You're going to hurt the joints and you're not going to be able to pinch anymore. You're going to lose your job and you're going to starve. But that's fine. The capitalist doesn't care because they're just going to find somebody else, some other person who has no skills to pinch, pinch, pinch. The other thing is, you're not getting paid very much. So on the one hand, you're miserable and your job is pointless and you have no job security and you do not have the satisfaction of making a shoe. Cobblers made shoes. At the end of the day, they thought, I made a shoe, and they sold it to someone. And that was good to make a shoe for someone that they could use. Pinch, pinch, pinch is not good. It's miserable. It hurts you. And you're pretty useless, except for that tiny bit of pinching. You are useless to society. But you're super useful in your exploitation to that factory owner because you are making profit or surplus value. That's the Marxist term, surplus value. Okay, so pre-capitalism, there's not a lot of surplus value produced. The cobbler pays a certain amount of money for the raw materials, and he spends his time making shoes, and he sells the shoes for whatever the raw materials cost, plus what he needs to eat and live. That's the goal for the cobbler. Maybe to hire an apprentice, maybe to open a second shop, maybe to have a slightly bigger house. But mostly, that's all surplus, right? The raw material plus the cobbler's labor might eventually buy the cobbler a bigger house. That's the surplus, is the money left over after he has eaten and fed his family and paid his mortgage or whatever. The money left over is the surplus value. Well, who gets it? The cobbler does. And how much is it? Not that much. Marx says, well, in capitalism, the rules are totally different. First of all, now there's tons of surplus value. Because whereas one cobbler made one shoe, 10 cobblers would make 10 shoes. But 10 workers in a factory, each doing that one little task over and over and over again, they get really good. It's really faster. So 10 factory workers don't make 10 shoes. They make 1,000 shoes. But each one of them gets paid way less than the cobbler did. So we've got a problem. Where's all that money going? Surplus value. It goes to the capitalist. And what will the capitalist do with that money? build a bigger factory, buy more factories, make more and more shoes. Well, let's say produce shoes. The capitalist doesn't make any shoes. The factory workers make the shoes. And the capitalist gets all the money. And Marx says this is an abomination. This is immoral. This is horrible. On the one hand, the joy of work has been removed from the cobbler when the cobbler has become unemployed and been replaced with the aglet pincher. I hope that's the right word because I've said it a bunch of times. On the other hand, all of the wealth produced by this enormous increase in productivity goes to someone who doesn't even do any work, who does no labor. This is what is wrong with capitalism, according to Marx. The alienation of the worker, Max Weber calls it disenchantment of the world. There's no values anymore. There's no joy in work, but there's no joy in religion or science or anything. It all just becomes capitalism, according to Marx and Weber. On the other hand, not only has all of happiness been destroyed, but, lives have simply been destroyed. People do not have enough food. People do not have the basic things they need because the incentive of the capitalist is to make more and more money. So the irony of capitalism, and this is why Marx says it will definitely fall apart. And it's true. I would say capitalism's fall is inevitable if it were as simple as what I'm about to say, is capitalism makes more stuff than ever before, but doesn't give enough stuff to live to the people making the stuff. So Marx says if that happens, capitalism is going to fall apart. You cannot have a world where people make more food than ever before, but the people who are making the food don't have enough food to eat. And I agree, that will inevitably be destroyed, but this sort of pure capitalism that Marx is talking about, Marx says pure capitalism is going to be everywhere and destroy everything. That hasn't happened yet. It's not going to happen. We have not had a completely disenchanted world. We have not had a completely capitalist world. I will stop there. We will pick this up again with our readings next week. And actually, from here on in, we're going to talk about why capitalism has not been fully triumphant. It's not to say that the other things that remain besides capitalism are good, but why capitalism has not been fully triumphant, why there are other ways of being in the world with relationship to production and work and labor. We'll talk about that starting next week with Kropotkin, but I'll leave it right there. Because now, automation. I've got to talk about the machine. So the machine is pretty simple in Marx. The machine is the thing that creates more surplus value for the capitalist. That's all it is. So I am pinching those aglets, and I can pinch 1,000 aglets a day. Now, what if there's a little crimper that I put in my hand and I crimp, and I can crimp faster, and I can crimp 10,000 aglets a day? Marx says this is what a machine is. It's something that makes the worker more productive. And what will happen if we invent this crimping machine? It uses my labor, but it makes me much more efficient. Any guesses? Am I going to get paid more? No, I am not. Are we going to make more shoes? Maybe, but pretty soon every factory is going to have the same crimping machine, so we're not going to make more shoes as a society. We might put some other factories out of business, the ones that don't get the crimping machine soon enough. So what's going to happen? 9 out of 10 crimpers are going to get fired. 9 out of 10 aglet pinchers are going to get fired. That's what a machine is in Marxist orthodoxy. It's something that lets the capitalist pay the worker the same amount, but extract more money from them. If I am plowing a field with a mule, I can plow 40 acres. With a tractor, I can plow 1,000 acres. What does that mean? It just means a lot of farmers are going to lose their job and lose their land. It doesn't mean we are going to have more money. It doesn't mean we are going to have more food. It just means we are going to have greater exploitation. That's what a machine is, according to Marx. Okay, finally, I am at our reading. Remember, there is a reading that goes with this episode, but it is something for you to watch. For you to read after you have watched this. This is something that came, at least in the English-speaking world, relatively late in the second half of the 20th century when we got Marx's notebooks translated. The ideas he wrote down that he then turned into his book Das Kapital, which he never finished. He wrote the first volume of. And he wrote about machines in a different way. And he talked about machines as things that could do the work themselves. Now, if you paid attention when I was talking about Popper and the ridiculous religion that is Marxism, the main thing that the Marxists have said about this little fragment on machines is that good thing Marx threw it away because the machines can do the work itself. We don't need the kind of revolution that Marx predicts. So since that revolution is inevitable and Marx is right, this fragment is wrong. Even though Marx himself wrote this, it's like, oh, this is okay. This contradicts Marx, but this was just a first draft, and definitely everything else he said that's completely contradictory with this thing that he also wrote is definitely true. Okay, sorry Marxists. No, I'm not sorry Marxists. You know who you are, and you're wrong. I'll see you in the comments. So this is really interesting. When I was creating this course, some of my students asked me, what would Marx have said about machines if he had lived a little longer and seen the possibilities of automation? And I can't remember what response I gave them, but whatever it was wrong. Because I hadn't read this fragment at this time. Oh, I know what I did. I told them Marx's theory of labor. How machines are just ways to exploit the worker. There's another possibility. This is the fully automated part. What if the machine crimps the aglet all by itself? I hope the aglet isn't just the eye of the shoe. I don't know. Sorry. I should have looked it up before I used it as my example. What if the machine does it on its own? There's two options, Marx says, and he goes through the ramifications in this fragment. I won't talk through it too much, but one is that humans will come to work only with their minds. You can think of this as the designed in California, manufactured in China idea. Everyone will just be a creative thought worker. Doesn't this sound cool? That's option one. The other option is, what if the machine can think for itself? What if we have AI? What if we don't need the engineers in California? Right now, the engineers in California and capitalism makes workers in China build the things that the engineers designed, with the goal that we will still have the engineers, but Foxconn, the company that makes those things that Apple designs, is trying to get rid of workers. That's one option. The thought work will be done by humans. The machines will do the grunt work, the labor that no one wants to do. Marx also posits another option. What if the machine does all of it? And he doesn't really pick it up in a way that I find useful. But I do find this fragment fascinating, especially in its challenge to the old or other or orthodox idea of machines. What if the machines can do it all? What does that mean for capitalism and its future? Okay, for next week, we are reading a work by Peter Kropotkin. In the first couple of videos, Kropotkin is the guy on the poster behind me. He's an anarcho-communist. He's in the line of Bakunin, who is Marx's greatest enemy. He has a different theory of labor and value and productivity and machines. I've been very mean to Marx. I love Kropotkin. I will be very interested to hear what you think. Okay, this is week 3 of Fully Automated Luxury Gay Space Communism. If you haven't watched the other videos, they're on the playlist, and I hope to have the week 4 video on Kropotkin recorded next week. Bye.